Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. Now, there's a critical word in those verses we just read together that if we don't get straight, we have a hard time really with most of the First Testament, but certainly with the book of Judges, and it's the word covenant. What I want to get clear is that God doesn't come to them while they're slaves in the middle of their desperation and have them make an agreement. He delivered them from slavery in Egypt with no agreement. He didn't make them sign any dotted line. He didn't make them commit to any stipulations of the covenant. He didn't give them the 10 Commandments. He didn't tell them how to make sacrifices. He didn't do any of that. God simply by His grace and His compassion went into the nation of Egypt and set His people free. And He brought them into the wilderness of Mount Sinai. And it was then that He said, what do you want to do next? I've set you free. I've demonstrated my care for you. Do you want to continue to be my people, or are we going to go our separate ways? That's what happens at Mount Sinai. And the people wanted to stay with God. And so it was Israel that agreed to the covenant. And that covenant was not only binding on them. It wasn't an agreement that they're the only ones who had any responsibilities. God had responsibilities too. If they followed the stipulations of the covenant, 10 Commandments, mercy towards strangers and foreigners, care for one another, then God would bless them by bringing them into the land that He promised, and He would cause the rains to come in their seasons and the crops to be productive, and He would make that place a livable place, and He would keep them safe enough. That was the stipulations of the covenant. And they both agreed to it. But that covenant was exclusive, and that's what we find here in chapter 2. It wasn't overly burdensome. God wasn't a jerk in the way He wrote it. It didn't have secret hidden clauses that were going to get them in the end, but it was exclusive. They were not allowed to make covenants with anybody else. They were not allowed to make binding relationships with the people of the land. And yet, they did. I take Judges to be theologically interpreted history. So these are not fairy tales to me. I don't read this story as a moral lesson or an allegory or some sort of a metaphor for our lives, but that didn't happen. It's just made up. I do not read it that way. In reading and interpreting these texts, I assume that they happened. However, I think the reason they are recorded for us is because, at the very least, they reveal to us some of the pattern by which God interacts with humanity throughout history and even today, both corporately and personally. And so I'm going to draw some applications out of this story that come from that pattern that I see repeated, not only in the book of Judges, but throughout the First Testament and into the New Testament and into our lives today. And the pattern, I think, is this. And I'm just going to say it here at the beginning. We're going to spend the morning talking about it, and then we'll talk about it at the end. And it's this. Those enemies, and remember, in our culture, they're not people or nations, but we'll talk about what they are. But in Israel's day, they certainly were people and nations. Those enemies that we do not cooperate with God in overcoming, God will ensure become consequences in our lives. He will enslave us to that which we refuse to be free from. We're going to talk about that today. It's certainly what happened to the Israelites, and it seems throughout the Bible that God does this over and over and over again. For a New Testament text, if you just want to be looking at it, I'm not going to ever turn there today, but the same principle is at stake as Romans chapters 1 and 2. Why did the Israelites fail to fulfill the stipulations of the covenant? Why did they refuse and fail to fulfill their obligations to God and their relationship to Him? It seems to me in the passage we just read together that there are three things that got in their way. 3 obstacles at least. And I'm not saying these are the only things that ever get in our way, but I think these are 3 things that have always gotten in our way and will continue to get in our way when we think about what it means to fully follow God. The first is fear. The second is forgetfulness. And the third is fleshliness. Fear, forgetfulness, and fleshliness. We're going to start with fear. And for this, we really have to go a few verses back into chapter 1. The whole end of chapter 1 lists the cities that the Israelites refused to attack. The cities of the Canaanites that they just let be, that they did not try to go up against for one reason or another. And our question is, why? Why didn't they do it? If God told them to do it, if God had waited for 1,000 years to bring this judgment, why did the Israelites refuse to do it? And we find out a little piece of that puzzle in chapter 1, verse 19. If you have your Bibles, you can look there. Talking about the tribe of Judah, who of all the tribes, because there were 12 tribes of Israel, was the most successful in their campaigns, they also left some people alone, and this is why. Chapter 1, verse 19. The Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. Now, Israelite people never mastered chariotry. And for anyone who knows anything about ancient warfare, having heavy cavalry and chariots was a huge advantage. And for that reason, they refused to fight them. So there was a fear that was similar to that which had kept the Israelites out of the land of promise to begin with. And so God says in chapter 3, verse 3, through the angel of the Lord, "So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you." Why didn't they want to do it? Why didn't they just march up to the cities with chariots and expect to win? Because it's a lot of work that they didn't want to do, and a lot of fear that they didn't want to get over. But Israel failed to believe that God would ask them only to conquer those things he would help them to conquer. They failed to believe that. They thought God would give them an impossible task and let them get slaughtered. They failed to believe that God would only ask them to conquer an enemy that he would have been with them to defeat. And the question for us today is, would God ask us to defeat an enemy that he will not be with us to defeat? Would he ask something of us that he will not make possible in us? Will he? It says a lot of what we think about God and how we answer that. Fear is a powerful reducer of faith. If we are terrified of the enemy God has asked us to overcome, enough fear will keep us from even fighting the battle. We'll make a treaty with it, and we'll try to live with it. Israel lived in a season of God's judgment on the Canaanite peoples after 1,000 years of God's patient forbearance. We live in a season of God's mercy. God is not asking the people of faith to attack anybody. That sword, according to Paul in Romans 13, is given to governments, not to the church. We live in a season of God's mercy, but enemies still abound. In the new covenant of Jesus, the enemy is not without, but within. One might say that in this season, God's judgment has fallen upon a very particular location, the human heart itself. This is the subject of God's judgment, and each of us has been tasked with cooperating with God and conquering the incipient self-obsession that lives there. These are the Canaanites we have to displace, and many of us have made treaties with it, just as Israel did before us. Fear. We're afraid that we cannot defeat these enemies. The second obstacle for Israel in fully living into the covenant they made with God is their forgetfulness. Look at chapter 2. This is a little further than the passage we read together. Verses 7 through 10, we find out that they had early success in the land, but then the leadership of that generation who had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and had anticipated conquest came in with Joshua. They died. And this is what we have in verse 10. Moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Some people witness firsthand the activity of God in history. They're there for it. They see it. And fear has a reduced influence over them. because they saw it with their own eyes. We see this during the initial conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. We see it in the earliest days of the church with the apostles who witnessed Jesus' resurrection from the dead, who watched him ascend into the heavens in front of their own eyes. Fear has a reduced impact on those people because they were there. They saw it. They don't have to trust anybody else's testimony. The greater challenge that faith encounters come in the second and the third and the fourth generations. The generations of those who have to put their faith in the testimony of someone else, who can't simply trust their own experience. This is the problem. And God has a way of reaching into every generation and speaking to some people, but never to every person. And so most of us will always have to trust the testimony of those who have had an experience we will never have. And we forget. During seasons of God's silence, seasons in which those things aren't happening so frequently, those are the seasons when the false prophets historically have arisen. And they don't all intend to be false, but they start to pretend that they're hearing from God. And some of them believe it. And they tell the stories about how God spoke to them, but it's nothing like the way God spoke to Abraham or to Jeremiah, but they convince themselves it is. False prophets rise when God is silent. And so we have to work hard in those seasons to remember. We have to read the stories of the prophets and apostles. And anyone in our lives who has had an encounter like that with God has to have the courage to share it. But at the same time, we need to have the wisdom to not embellish it. And those have to be shared. Because every generation has enough. But it will never be all of us. They are fearful that they couldn't conquer the enemy God gave them to conquer. They were forgetful of the victories God had given in the past. And finally, the final obstacle is fleshliness. Chapter 2, verse 11 through chapter 3, verse 6. I'm just going to read chapter 2, beginning in verse 18. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. Why does Israel continue to stumble in the same places over and over again? And why have we? Well, other gods, any god other than the God of Israel, seems more controllable and more concerned with the day-to-day bodily needs of humans. Today's idol is science. Now, science is not a religion in the classical sense, but it is an idol. What's going to protect you tomorrow from the asteroids falling from the sky? Science. What's going to protect you from power failure and keep you safe when you have no power in New Hampshire? Where do you put your faith? In a generator, right? Technology. What's going to protect us tomorrow from cancer and from the next health epidemic and from AIDS and whatever else comes? Science. This is our idol. And we like our human-made idols because oftentimes they don't look like religions at all. They just look like practical thinking. And they're made by us, so they cater to us. In every generation, it's already been done. When every bodily urge, from eating to sex to violence to aberrant behavior to risk-taking, when all that can be understood as a legitimate form of worship that will get us more food, more wealth, more security, humans are enticed. This is just religions. They serve a couple of basic functions everywhere in the world. They stabilize society. They make society more peaceful. They indoctrinate people into understanding why society works the way it does, and they sell them that this is what they need to do to be good people. Religions increase coping mechanisms so people accept their lot in life better. And it provides us with the illusion of control. That's religion. That by doing certain things, we'll have more control over our world and our lives and our health than we normally would. The Judeo-Christian religion has been difficult for many to follow. Because, and hear me in this church, Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is more concerned with who we are than with what we have. He's more concerned with who we are than the quality of our lives. He's more concerned with who we are than the quality of the environments in which we live. And we hate him for it. Not you and me, I hope, but many in the world. I suspect this remains a principal obstacle for us today. We are more concerned with our flesh than with who we are. Quite frankly, it's so much more appealing to follow a God who promises food, family, fun, and frivolity than it is a God who wants peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control. The God of Israel offers a more substantial calling, a more substantial way, a way of being a different kind of person no matter our circumstances. And it's a humbling way because we have to admit we don't have the tools to do it on our own. But Israel failed over and over again out of their fear, out of their forgetfulness, and out of their fleshliness. We must learn from that three things, and this is how I'll end today. 1, God will never ask us to overcome a foe that he will not be with us to defeat. 2, God makes himself known recurrently through human history, and we need to listen to those testimonies. And we need to give those testimonies if we have the privilege of encountering this God, which is a rare occurrence in human history. And 3, the fleshly concerns of life are fleeting and temporary. They seem so important, but it's who we are that is eternal. And this is the target of Jesus, who you are. Not where you live, who you are. Who I am. Israel wept crocodile tears in chapter 2, verse 4. They played the child card. Israel, they wept when God told them the consequences of their disobedience. But they didn't weep because they were bad people or because they had wanted to be better than they were. They wept because they got caught and now they were going to be punished. When we long, church, for transformation, we will finally be free. We'll be ready to join God in the conquest of our self-obsession. We have the God of all creation with us. And if he asks us to defeat these enemies, he must be willing to do it. But not without us. Not for us. Do you see what he said in that verse in chapter 2? I will not drive them out for you. Because you wouldn't fight them, I will enslave you to them. It's actually what Paul says in Romans chapters 1 and 2. And here's our final word. Those enemies that you make treaties with, that I make treaties with, those enemies that we refuse to fight, that we refuse to believe God can overcome, he will make them our masters. It's the same with anger. It's the same with lust. It's the same with gossip. It's the same with impatience. It's the same with unforgiveness. These are the cities in the land he's asked us to conquer. We cannot make treaties with them. We cannot make agreements that keep them alive in our lives. Are you ready? He wouldn't take us to the cusp of the land and ask us to conquer it if he couldn't do it. Stop looking at the chariots and look behind you for the one who's with you. If you believe you will fail, and you believe they're unbeatable, guess what happened to the Israelites? They thought they couldn't defeat people with chariots, so what happened? They didn't defeat people with chariots. Let's wage war, not against each other, but against that self-obsession that lives within each of us. That's the enemy. That's the land each of us has to take. So let's do it. I know, the chariots, right? He will help us.